The sound was not a sound at all, but a concussion that traveled through the soles of Ilara's worn leather boots. The floorboards of the redemption bank trembled, and a fine layer of dust sifted down from the rafters, catching the midday sun in 1,000 glittering motes. Then came the noise, the splintering crack of the doorframe giving way, followed by a collective gasp that sucked the air from the room. Ilara, 19 and poised at the teller's window to deposit the meager earnings from her sewing, froze with her small cloth purse clutched in her hand. 3 men spilled into the bank, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, their movements economical and sharp. The townsfolk, a rancher, the blacksmith's wife, a few prospectors flattened themselves against the walls or dove behind overturned furniture. The air moments before, thick with the smell of old paper and coin metal, now tasted of gunpowder and raw fear. The leader moved differently from the others. While his men were frenetic, barking orders and waving pistols, he walked into the center of the room with a chilling deliberation. He was tall, dressed in dark, trail-worn clothes, and his eyes, visible above the bandana, were not wild, but unnervingly calm, the color of a winter sky. They swept the room, cataloging the terror with an unnerving detachment. The vault, one of his men snarled at the trembling bank manager, Mr. Abernathy. But the leader raised a single leather-gloved hand. No. The word was quiet, yet it cut through the chaos like a razor. His men stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shouting had been. The leader's gaze continued its slow, methodical sweep until it landed on Ilara. She felt it like a physical touch, a cold finger tracing the line of her spine. He took a step toward her, then another. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She was the daughter of Elias Thorne, the town's founder, a man revered as a saint. People in Redemption treated her with a mixture of respect and pity. The orphan girl who carried her father's heroic legacy. She was not supposed to be in the middle of such brutal worldly violence. The man stopped directly in front of her. He smelled of horse leather and the vast, empty desert. He ignored the purse she held out with a shaking hand, her week's earnings a pathetic offering. His cold eyes were fixed on her throat, on the glint of silver nestled in the hollow of her collarbone. It was a locket, simple and unadorned, its surface worn smooth by the touch of 3 generations of Thorne women. It held tiny, faded portraits of her parents. It was her mother's, the only tangible piece of her she had left. "Please," Ilara whispered, the sound barely audible. "Take the money." He did not seem to hear her. With a movement too quick to follow, he reached out. His gloved fingers were surprisingly gentle as they brushed her skin, but his grip on the delicate silver chain was iron. He didn't unclasp it. He simply ripped it from her neck. The chain snapped with a faint metallic ping, stinging her skin. He held the locket in his palm, his thumb tracing its smooth, familiar curve. He looked from the locket back to her face, and for a fleeting moment the coldness in his eyes was eclipsed by something else. A flicker of bitter recognition of ancient pain. It was not the look of a common thief. It was the look of a man settling a score she didn't know existed. "Debts must be paid," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. Then turning to his men, he gave a sharp nod. "We're done here." Without another glance at the money, the gold, or the terror-stricken people, they were gone. They moved like wraiths, melting back into the blinding glare of the redemption sun. Dust swirled in the ruined doorway where they had been. A profound silence descended, broken only by Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, beginning to sob. Ilara stood frozen, her hand pressed to her throat where the locket used to be. A thin red line marked her skin, a necklace of pain. It wasn't the robbery that had shattered the world. It wasn't the violence. It was the violation. He had looked at her as if he knew her. and he had taken the one thing that connected her to her past, to the sainted memory of her mother. The act felt intensely, terrifyingly personal. In that moment, the restless yearning she'd always felt for a life beyond redemption's borders crystallized into a single burning purpose. She didn't know his name or why he'd targeted her, but she knew with a certainty that shook her to her very soul that she would get it back. Redemption was a town built on a story. The story, as every child knew, it was that of Elias Thorne, Ilara's father. A man of vision and courage, he had carved this oasis from the unforgiving wilderness, wresting the land from barrenness and bestowing upon it the gift of civilization. The town square boasted a bronze statue of him, his hand outstretched not in conquest, but in welcome. He had died a hero's death years ago, protecting the town from bandits, leaving behind a legacy as solid and enduring as the granite peaks that watched over them. Ilara lived in the house her father had built, a modest but sturdy timber frame at the edge of town. It was a shrine to his memory, cared for by the town as much as by her. In the evenings, she would trace the lines in the faded photograph on the mantelpiece, her father handsome and resolute, her mother gentle-eyed and smiling, the silver locket a bright star at her throat. That locket was the linchpin of her history, the proof of a love she barely remembered. Her mother had succumbed to fever when Ilara was 5, her father falling a year later. The locket was all that remained of their touch. Now it was gone. "You're to do nothing, you hear me?" Sheriff Brody's voice was stern, but his eyes were filled with a weary kindness. He was a man worn down by the sun and the thankless task of keeping peace at the edge of the world. He sat opposite her at her small kitchen table, his hat resting on his knee. "This isn't some storybook villain, Ilara. The man you described sounds like Silas Kane. His name is a curse in these parts. He's not just an outlaw, he's a ghost. He and his men ride the Badlands like they were born to them. This is my job." He didn't take any money, Sheriff Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. Her hands were wrapped around a cold cup of tea, her knuckles white. "He only took my locket." He looked right at me. "Why?" Brody shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Kane's a strange one. He has his reasons for things, and they're never simple. Maybe he just wanted to leave his mark to sow fear." He paused, then added, "Your father brought law to this valley. Men like Kane hate that." Maybe it was a message. But Ilara knew it was more than that. She remembered the look in Kane's eyes. It was a look that spoke of history, of a grievance that ran deeper than a simple hatred of the law. She'd spent her life feeling like a porcelain doll, the town's precious relic. Now that doll was cracked, and for the first time, she felt a fire inside her. The restlessness that had once sent her wandering to the riverbank now had a direction. It pointed out into the vast, shimmering heat of the desert. "I understand," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. The sheriff nodded, relieved. "Good girl. Lock your doors. We'll get him." But as he left, Ilara's eyes fell upon the locked cedar chest at the foot of her bed. It held her father's things, his worn maps, his sturdy compass, his heavy Colt revolver, and a leather gun belt, the oiled leather still supple. He was a hero, a man of action. What would he have done? That night, she didn't sleep. The town of Redemption, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Its predictability, its gentle rhythms, the very story it was built upon, felt hollow. The horizon she had so often stared at no longer seemed like a distant dream, but a summons. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was something stronger, a fierce, unwavering resolve. Before the sun had even begun to hint at its arrival, Ilara was moving. By the dim light of a single lantern, She packed a canvas satchel with dried jerky, a small water skin, and a handful of biscuits. She opened her father's chest. The smell of old leather and gun oil filled the small room. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of a needle and thread, felt clumsy and foreign as she buckled the heavy gun belt around her waist. The revolver felt like a lead weight on her hip, an alien and terrible thing. She took the maps, stuffing them into the satchel. She scribbled a short note for Sheriff Brody, a simple apology for the trouble she was about to cause, and left it on the kitchen table. Slipping out the back door, she made her way to the livery stable. Her horse, a placid mare named Willow, nickered softly as she saddled her. As she rode out of Redemption, the town was still swathed in the deep blue shadows of pre-dawn. The statue of her father stood in the square, a dark, silent sentinel. For the first time, she looked at it and felt not pride, but a pang of doubt. The world was not as simple as his story suggested. It was a place where men with cold eyes stole memories and whispered of debts. The trail leading out of town was dusty and familiar. But as the sun finally broke over the distant mesas, casting long, stark shadows across the land, she felt she was riding off the edge of the map. She was no longer Elara Thorne, the founder's daughter. She was just a girl alone, hunting a ghost in a land that swallowed secrets whole. And she had never felt more alive. The desert was a liar. From the hills above Redemption, it had looked like a serene painted landscape of reds and oranges. Up close, it was a brutal adversary. The sun was a hammer beating down relentlessly. The shimmering heat, rising from the cracked earth, distorted the horizon, turning distant buttes into wavering, ghostly figures. After 2 days, Elara's lips were cracked, her skin was burned raw despite her wide-brimmed hat, and a fine layer of grit covered everything, finding its way into her eyes, her mouth, and the folds of her clothes. She was an amateur. The tracks she followed, 3 horses riding hard, were clear at first, in the soft dust outside of town. But soon the trail crossed over vast plains of sun-baked rock, where the hoofprints vanished entirely. She'd spend hours casting about in wide, desperate circles, her frustration mounting with every fruitless search. Her father's maps were of territories, not trails. They showed mountains and rivers, but not the subtle language of the land that a true tracker could read. On the 3rd day, her water ran out. The silence of the desert pressed in on her, a physical weight. It was a silence composed of a million tiny noises, the scuttling of a lizard, the dry rasp of the wind over stone, the frantic beat of her own heart. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping thing that was worse than the heat. She slumped over Willow's neck, the world swimming in a dizzying haze. This was it. This was how her foolish quest would end, a small, forgotten tragedy in the vast, uncaring wilderness. She wasn't sure if she heard the sound first or simply felt the presence. Willow's ears twitched, and the mare came to a halt without any command. Elara forced her head up. A figure stood on a nearby rocky outcrop, silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. He was as still as the rock he stood on, a part of the landscape, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he might be one of Cain's men. He started down the scree slope, his movements sure-footed and economical. As he drew closer, she saw he was not one of the outlaws. He was older, his face a roadmap of lines carved by sun and hardship. A thick, grizzled beard covered his jaw, and his eyes were a startlingly pale blue, sharp and assessing. He carried a long rifle with a comfortable ease and led a tough-looking Mustang that watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze taking in her sunburnt face, her empty water skin, the heavy, useless revolver on her hip. "You're a long way from home, girl," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. "I'm tracking someone." Elara managed her throat so dry, the words came out as a croak. "You're dying," he corrected her, his tone flat without pity. He unslung a canteen from his saddle and held it out. "Drink. Slow." The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank in small, disciplined sips, feeling life seep back into her. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "I'm looking for Silas Kane," she said, her voice a little stronger. A flicker of something surprise, maybe even a grim respect, passed through his pale eyes. "Plenty of folks are looking for Kane. Most are better equipped than you." He gestured to her father's pistol. "You even know how to use that thing?" Alara's cheeks flushed with shame. "No." He grunted. "Kane went through here 2 days ago. Rode northeast toward the cinder cones. But you lost his trail back at the wash. You've been chasing shadows since yesterday morning." Her hope faltered. "How do you know?" "It's my business to know," he said simply. He took the canteen back and slung it over his shoulder. "Your business is to turn that horse around and ride back to wherever you came from before this land swallows you whole." He turned to leave. Panic seized her. He was her only chance. "Wait," she called out, sliding off Willow's back. Her legs were shaky, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Please, I need your help." He took something from me. Something that can't be replaced. He paused but didn't turn around. "Vengeance is a fool's errand, girl. It'll get you killed." "It's not vengeance," she insisted, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "It's justice. I need to get it back." He was silent for a long moment. The wind whispered around them, kicking up small dust devils. Finally, he turned back, his gaze intense. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and seemed to see past the naive town girl to the core of iron resolve that had driven her out here. "I don't work for hire," he said, "and I don't get involved in other people's fights." "I'm not asking you to fight for me," Alara said, taking a bold step forward. "Just teach me. Teach me what you know. Teach me how to survive out here, how to track him." He studied her, his head tilted slightly. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Alara held her breath, refusing to look away. This was her test. At last, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "The cinder cones are 3 days' ride. Hard riding. You fall behind, I leave you." He didn't offer his name, and she didn't ask. There was an unspoken agreement in the air. This was a partnership born of necessity, not friendship. He mounted his Mustang. "My name is Jedediah," he said gruffly, as if the words themselves were an inconvenience. "Now get on your horse. Track's going cold." As she swung herself into Willow's saddle, a wave of relief and trepidation washed over her. She had found a guide, but she had also found a master. The trials she had endured so far were nothing. Her real education in the brutal, beautiful, and deadly world beyond redemption was just beginning. Jedediah's training was as unforgiving as the landscape itself. There were no gentle words of encouragement, no patience for her mistakes. There was only the land and the stark lessons it offered. Her first lesson was in silence. "You walk like a cow in a belfry," he'd grumbled on that first evening as they made camp. "Every step you take, you're announcing yourself to anything with ears for 5 miles. He showed her how to place her feet heel to toe to read the ground before she stepped on a dry twig to use the whisper of the wind to mask her sound. The next day was water. He didn't just give her water, he made her find it. He pointed to a line of distant cottonwoods. "Trees like that don't grow without a drink," he said, and then watched as she spent 2 hours digging in the sandy wash until her fingers were raw and she finally hit damp soil. then a muddy, life-giving trickle. She learned that survival wasn't about strength. It was about observation. He taught her how to use the Colt. The first time she fired it, the kick sent a shock up her arm, and the blast left her ears ringing. Her shot went wide, puffing up dust 10 feet from the cactus she'd aimed at. "You're fighting it," Jedediah said, his voice calm. He adjusted her stance, showed her how to breathe out as she squeezed the trigger, not pull it. "Don't think of it as a weapon. It's a tool. Respect it, and it'll do its job." Her hand stopped shaking. Her next shot hit the cactus with a satisfying thud. She didn't feel like a killer. She felt a flicker of competence, a sense that she was no longer completely helpless. As they rode, Jedediah would point out things she had never noticed, the subtle difference between the track of a shod horse carrying a heavy rider and one carrying a lighter one. The way bent grass could tell you how long ago something had passed. The droppings that revealed what an animal had been eating, and thus where it might be headed. The desert, once a terrifying void, began to transform into a tapestry of stories, rich with information for anyone who knew how to read it. Their conversations were sparse and practical, mostly revolving around the trail or the immediate needs of survival. Yet in the quiet moments around the campfire at night, a different kind of communication began to form. He would wordlessly hand her a piece of roasted rabbit. She would mend a tear in his shirt while he cleaned his rifle. These small gestures of mutual reliance built a bridge of trust across the chasm of their different worlds. One evening, as the sky bled into a spectacular canvas of purple and orange, she found the courage to ask him about himself. "Why are you out here alone?" He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. "I was a scout once," he said, his voice low. "For the army. Led men into places they shouldn't have been. Saw things a man shouldn't have to see." He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the twilight. "The silence out here? It's honest. It don't lie to you. Not like men do." His quiet confession was a gift, a glimpse into the pain that had shaped him. She felt a new wave of respect for this grizzled, solitary man. He was not just a recluse. He was a man seeking penance in the vast cathedral of the wilderness. They found Silas Kane's trail again 2 days later. But the signs they discovered were strange. Instead of a man fleeing, they found evidence of a man on a mission. Outside the abandoned settlement of Dust Devil Creek, they found the old town sign bearing the name of the founding prospector, hacked to pieces with an axe. A day later, they passed a well, one of the few reliable water sources in the region, and found it poisoned, a dead coyote floating in its depths. A crudely carved K was burned into the well's wooden housing. This isn't the work of a man running from the law. Jedediah observed his brow furrowed as he studied the poisoned well. This is a statement. Ilara's unease grew. Each act of destruction seemed pointed symbolic. She remembered the name of the prospector on the shattered sign, the man who had dug this very well. He was an old business partner of her father's, mentioned in his journals. The connection was undeniable. Silas Kane wasn't just riding through this territory. He was systematically erasing pieces of her father's history, one landmark at a time. Her quest for the locket was becoming entangled in something much larger, a dark history she was only just beginning to uncover. The simple story of a righteous man building a town was starting to fray at the edges, revealing a more complicated and sinister pattern beneath. The midpoint of their journey came at a place called Whisper Rock, a cluster of wind-carved hoodoos that moaned when the wind blew through them. They found the remains of a camp, and it was clear it had been abandoned in a hurry. A bedroll was left behind, along with a half-eaten meal. It had been Silas Kane's camp, but it had been ransacked. Someone else was out here, and they were also hunting him. "Looks like Cain has more than just the law on his tail," Jedediah muttered, scanning the surrounding rocks with a scout's practiced eye. While he kept watch, Ilara searched the camp. Tucked inside the discarded bedroll, she found a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with elegant, surprisingly neat script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words inside were not the rantings of a madman, but the cold, articulate fury of a man nursing a generations-old wound. He wrote of a family named Cain, the first settlers in this valley, who had built a ranch and a life from nothing. He wrote of their friendship with a charismatic newcomer named Elias Thorne. He wrote of a partnership of a shared dream to build a town. And then he wrote of betrayal, of forged documents of a stolen land deed, and of his family being driven from their home under the threat of violence, left to perish in the desert. The new town built on their land was given a beautiful, ironic name: Redemption. The journal was signed Silas Cain, son of Marcus Cain. Ilara's world tilted on its axis. She sank to the ground, the journal falling from her numb fingers. The hero of her childhood, the sainted founder of her town, was a thief, a liar, possibly a murderer. Her entire life, her very identity was built upon a crime. The town's prosperity, her own comfortable upbringing, it was all paid for with the blood and sorrow of another family. "What is it?" Jedediah asked, his voice sharp. She couldn't speak. She could only point to the open page. He came over and read it, his face grim. When he finished, he looked not at the journal, but at her. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. "A reason," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, "ain't an excuse. What his father suffered doesn't give him the right to poison wells and terrorize towns. But it explains the why. The locket. It wasn't a random theft. It was a symbol. He was taking back a piece of his family's history, a piece of the life Elias Thorne had stolen. And by taking it from her, he was ensuring that the sins of the father were visited upon the child. He wasn't just running, he was drawing her out, forcing a confrontation, a reckoning. Her quest was no longer a simple matter of retrieving a cherished object. It had become a journey into a poisoned past, her family's and her town's. The righteous anger that had fueled her was gone, replaced by a hollow ache of shame and a terrible, confusing weight of responsibility. She was not just hunting an outlaw. She was chasing the ghost of her father's crime. And she knew with a dreadful certainty that the end of this trail would force her to confront not only Silas Cain, but the very foundation of her world. Armed with the terrible knowledge from the journal, the nature of their pursuit changed. It was no longer a hunt. It was an interception. Jedediah, reading the landscape and the mind of a man bent on symbolic revenge, predicted Cain's next move. There's an old mission, San Alaron, in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. It was the first structure built in this valley, built by the Cain family. If he's looking to unmake your father's world, that's where he'll go last, to reclaim the first stone. They pushed their horses hard, the urgency now a palpable thing between them. They rode into a narrow, winding canyon, a shortcut Jedediah knew that would shave a day off their journey. The canyon walls rose high on either side, blotting out the sun and casting the path in a cool, deep shadow. The air was still and unnaturally quiet. "I don't like this," Jedediah said, his voice low as he reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon above them. "It's too quiet. A perfect place for an ambush." His words were prophetic. A sharp crack echoed from above, not a gunshot, but the sound of splintering rock. Ilara looked up to see a horrifying sight. A huge section of the canyon wall, a cascade of boulders and scree, was collapsing down toward them. "Ride," Jedediah yelled, spurring his Mustang forward. Ilara didn't hesitate. She kicked Willow into a gallop, her heart leaping into her throat. The roar of the rock slide was deafening, a grinding, thundering sound that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Dust and pebbles rained down on them. A boulder the size of a wagon wheel crashed to the ground just behind them, shattering into 1,000 pieces. They galloped madly, the horses straining their breaths, coming in ragged snorts of terror. The slide was chasing them, a relentless wave of destruction. They rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, just as the main flow of rock and debris sealed the path behind them. The sound of it, a final cataclysmic boom. They were alive, but they were trapped. The way back was completely blocked by a mountain of fresh rubble. Ahead, the canyon narrowed even further. They dismounted their horses, trembling and lathered in sweat. Ilara's legs felt like water. She leaned against the cool rock of the canyon wall, gasping for breath. The close call had stripped away every last vestige of her former self. In that mad dash for survival, she had been pure instinct, pure will. Jedediah checked on the horses before walking back to inspect the rock slide. He returned moments later, his face set in grim lines. That was no accident. The keystones were knocked loose, deliberately. Cain knew we were following. He led us in here. The realization was chilling. Silas Cain was not just a target. He was a hunter himself, and they had walked right into his trap. They were not just pursuing him. He was actively manipulating them, leading them toward a final confrontation on his own terms. Their bond, forged in the quiet hardships of the trail, was now sealed in the crucible of shared danger. That evening, as they made a cold camp in the trapped canyon, the usual silence between them felt different. It was no longer a silence of practicality, but of deep, shared understanding. Jedediah tended to a nasty gash on Willow's flank, his movements gentle and sure. Ilara, seeing him wince as he stretched his shoulder, noticed a dark bruise forming from where a falling rock must have struck him. Wordlessly, she took a clean cloth from her satchel, soaked it from her canteen, and pressed it against his shoulder. He flinched, but didn't pull away. He simply met her gaze, and in that moment, the unspoken truth of their partnership was laid bare. They needed each other. To survive the canyon, to face what was coming, they had to rely on one another completely. He had taught her how to survive in the wilderness, but she, in turn, was teaching him how to let someone in, how to accept help. The grizzled recluse and the founder's daughter were now just two people bound together by a common purpose and a shared fight for survival. They found their way out of the canyon the next day, through a treacherous goat path Jedediah discovered. The sky opened up before them, vast and gray. A storm was brewing. The wind picked up, howling through the rocks and carrying the first stinging grains of sand. On the horizon, obscured by the growing haze, were the dark outlines of the Dragoon Mountains and the crumbling bell tower of the San Alaron mission. They rode into the teeth of the storm. The wind grew to a gale, ripping at their clothes and forcing them to lean low over their horses' necks. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of brown sand. Visibility dropped to a few feet. It was a disorienting, suffocating world of sound and fury. The abandoned mission appeared out of the maelstrom like a ghost ship, its adobe walls eroded by time, its wooden cross tilted at a sorrowful angle. They tethered the horses in the relative shelter of a crumbling outer wall and pushed their way inside the main chapel. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the roof, and sand poured in through the empty window frames, coating the stone floor in a shifting, whispering carpet. In the center of the dust-filled cavernous space, a lone lantern cast a circle of flickering yellow light. Beside it stood Silas Cain. He was waiting for them. His bandana was down, revealing a face that was younger than Ilara had expected, but marked by a severity that made him seem ancient. His dark eyes burned with an intelligent, patient fire. The silver locket hung from a leather cord around his neck. "I knew you would come, daughter of Thorn," he said, his voice calm and clear above the howl of the storm. "A man like Jedediah could not resist the mystery of my trail. And you? You could not resist the pull of your own history." "This has to end," Cain Jedediah said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Silas ignored him, his eyes fixed on Alara. "And no, this is a beginning, a correction. Your father built his legacy on the ruins of my family. He built a town called Redemption on unredeemable sin. I am simply balancing the books." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of parchment. He tossed it onto a dilapidated wooden crate between them. "The original deed to this valley. Signed by my grandfather and by yours. A partnership agreement. Your father lost his copy, presented a forged one, granting him sole ownership, and ran my family off their own land." Alara stepped forward and picked it up. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the signatures were unmistakable. Her father's familiar, confident scrawl next to the elegant signature of one Marcus Cain. The secondary twist she had feared, the confirmation she had dreaded, was now a physical reality in her hands. It was all true. My father. He was a hero, she whispered, the words sounding weak and foolish, even to her own ears. Your father was a thief who stole a future from my family so he could build one for you. Silas retorted, his voice hardening. He left my grandparents to die in the desert. My father survived, but he was a broken man, haunted by the injustice until the day he died. This locket, he touched the silver at his neck, belonged to my grandmother. She dropped it the day your father's men forced them from this very mission. It was found by a sympathizer and held for years. It is a symbol of all that was taken. And now I have taken it back. The roar of the wind outside was matched by the storm inside Alara. Everything she had believed was a lie, but looking at the cold fury in Silas's eyes, she saw the same poison that had destroyed his father was now consuming him. He wasn't seeking justice. He was perpetuating a cycle of vengeance. What you've done, she said, her voice finding a new strength, poisoning wells, destroying property. That isn't justice. It's just more hate. You've become the very thing you despise. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had expected tears, pleading, or righteous anger. He had not expected a reasoned indictment. This ends now, Silas, she said, her gaze steady. Not with more killing, but with the truth. A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. The truth won't feed the ghosts, girl. He drew his pistol. Only blood will. He moved, but Alara was ready. She didn't draw her own gun. Instead, she kicked the wooden crate hard, sending it sliding into his legs. As he stumbled, Jedediah fired not at Cain, but at the ancient, heavy mission bell hanging precariously from a rotten rope above him. The shot splintered the wood. The bell, a massive chunk of bronze, didn't fall, but it swung wildly on its frayed rope. Silas recovered his footing and aimed at Alara. But she was already moving, using the skills Jedediah had drilled into her. She dove behind a stone pillar as his shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the stone with a high-pitched whine. The swinging bell was now a chaotic pendulum. As it swung back, Silas was forced to duck, his attention divided. It was the opening she needed. She darted out, not toward him, but toward the frayed bell rope. Grabbing the end of it, she pulled with all her weight. The bell swung back toward Silas with terrifying momentum. He tried to dodge, but he was too slow. It didn't strike him squarely, but it delivered a glancing blow to his side that sent him crashing to the floor, his head striking the stone with a sickening crack. His pistol clattered away into the sandy darkness. He lay still, unconscious. The sandstorm raged outside, but inside the mission, a fragile silence fell. Alara stood her chest, heaving her hands, still gripping the rope. She had faced him. She had used her wits, her training, and her courage. And she had won not by taking a life, but by choosing to preserve it. The cycle of vengeance was broken. As if on cue, the fury of the sandstorm began to subside. The howling wind softened to a mournful sigh, and pale dust-filtered light began to seep through the chapel windows. The world outside was being reborn, clean and quiet. Jedediah moved to Silas's unconscious form quickly and efficiently, binding his hands and checking the gash on his head. It was bleeding, but it wasn't fatal. "You did good, Alara," he said, his voice laced with a deep, quiet pride. "You did what was right, not what was easy." Alara looked down at the deed still clutched in her hand, then at the unconscious man who had been both her tormentor and her teacher. She felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness for the generations of pain that had led them all to this dusty, forgotten place. The ride back to redemption was long and silent, a slow procession under a bruised-looking sky. Silas rode slumped in his saddle, his wrists bound to the horn, a sullen and defeated captive. They didn't speak of what had happened, but a new understanding flowed between Alara and Jedediah. Their journey was over, but something else was just beginning. When they arrived, leading Cain through the main street, the townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and awe. They stared at Alara, no longer seeing the fragile orphan girl, but a woman of formidable strength, her face smudged with dirt, her father's gun still strapped to her hip. She took Silas and the deed directly to Sheriff Brody's office. She laid the parchment on his desk and told him everything, the journal, the betrayal, the truth behind Redemption's founding. The sheriff listened, his weary face growing older with every word. The town's foundational lie was now exposed, and the law which he had sworn to uphold had to reckon with it. That evening, a town meeting was held in the saloon. The air was thick with tension and disbelief. Alara stood before them all, Jedediah, a silent, steadfast presence at her side, and she retold the story of Silas Cain and Elias Thorne. There was outrage, denial, and anger. But as they passed the deed from hand to hand, seeing the undeniable proof, the anger gave way to a troubled silence. Their town, their homes, their very history was built on a crime. In that moment, Alara and Jedediah shared a quiet look. Their shared ordeal was over. They had brought the truth to light, and now the town had to choose its own path forward. An unspoken promise hung in the air between them, a promise of a future together in this new, more honest version of redemption. Weeks passed. The town of Redemption did not collapse. It began to heal. The truth, however painful, was a clean wound. Under Alara's guidance, the town council began the difficult process of making amends, seeking out any surviving descendants of the Cain family, and proposing a just settlement. Silas Cain was imprisoned, his cycle of revenge broken by Alara's mercy awaiting trial, not as a simple outlaw, but as a man with a profound and legitimate grievance. Alara was no longer seen as a relic of a hero, but as a leader in her own right, a woman of integrity who had chosen truth over a comfortable lie. She had found her place not by escaping redemption, but by reshaping it. One cool autumn afternoon, she walked to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the cottonwood trees had turned a brilliant gold. She went first to her mother's grave. With gentle fingers, she unfastened the silver locket from her neck, the one Silas had worn, which the sheriff had returned to her, and laid it carefully on the smooth, weathered headstone. It was a tribute to a memory, a love she had honored. Then she turned to her father's grave. The bronze plaque still hailed him as founder and hero. She looked at it for a long moment, the conflict of love and disappointment warring within her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, simple bird carved from a piece of pale cottonwood. Jedediah had made it for her one night on the trail. She placed the wooden bird on the grave. It was not a symbol of honor nor of condemnation. It was a symbol of acknowledgement of his flawed, complex humanity and of her choice to forgive. She was letting go of the anger, not for his sake, but for her own. A quiet footstep sounded behind her. It was Jedediah. He came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He didn't speak, but simply stood with her looking out at the valley. "I thought you might be moving on," she said softly, not looking at him. Back to the silence. "Reckon I've had enough silence for one lifetime." He replied, his voice a low rumble. "This place, it's getting louder, more honest. I think I'll stay." He reached out and took her hand. His was calloused and rough, hers was slender but strong. They fit together perfectly. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, looking out at the horizon. It was no longer a boundary marking the edge of her world, but a golden line of promise, a beautiful and endless beginning.